Hey everybody, Alex here, and welcome to Video Games Gaiden. What is that? Rusty doesn't even know, and he's my
It's
guest for
news.
today. So, without further ado, let me explain what this is all going to be. For years on YouTube, kind of, I've been somewhat talking about my history in gaming. A Gaiden for I guess you could say, somewhat initiated in terms of Japanese culture. It's a side story. I'm sick and tired about talking about myself. I want to hear stories from other people. So, as you see over here to my left, your right, more than likely, depending on how I put all this together, we have LOOIE from YouTube, the second most handsome co-host on the Otaku Brothers podcast, Rusty. Rusty, how you doing today?
Excellent, Alex. So happy to be here. Was very excited when you reached out to me about this kind of partnership here for this little video that we're gonna do, talking about a game I personally love, but also just kind of chatting about games, chatting about platformers, our history with them, our love of the genre, everything in between. I don't know what the heck we're getting into. You sent me quite the itinerary of things and topics, and I'm just excited to be on the receiving end of an interview as opposed to always, conducting these discussions on the Otaku Brothers podcast. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and in case you guys aren't aware, Rusty has been co-leading a podcast for how many years now? It's like pushing 8.
Six, yeah, 6, 7 years now. It's been quite the endeavor. 160 plus episodes. Do it with my brother-in-law, Otaku Brothers. We're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but it's been a fun journey. It's been a fun journey.
So when are you going to restart the podcast?
I think it would be disingenuous to the Otaku Brother community if we didn't come back at least for the Game of the Year special. We do a two-parter, like a 3 to 4 hour discussion of our Game of the Years and lots of fun stats and all that good stuff. And then also a ridiculous community Game of the Year special where I basically have to read Lord of the Rings front to back 9 times. So it's intense. It's a lot of fun, but love hearing from the listeners and the games that stood out to them over the course of the year. So that's good times. But I do have a baby on the way, so that could complicate anything related to YouTube and podcast related going forward. But we'll see.
So it's going to be 3 of you on the show going forward then, right?
It might be. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's fine. That's fine. Another demographic you can tap into. You know, you
That's right.
you can start with like the Racing with Ryan community as well, and then there
Yeah.
from there you just monetize the heck out of it. So
Yeah.
so without I guess a little bit further ado, I do have a couple of questions for you. Now,
Awesome.
I am presuming most people know who you are.
Hmm.
Admittedly, you've been around since the glorious days of the YouTube gaming community, probably even longer. You were pretty much in diapers when you first started, and I wasn't as gray when I first started, and I was rocking a mullet most of the time. Um,
Yeah.
but that being said, some folks may not know you. Maybe they just discovered you recently. So I have 3 random questions I'm going to ask you. You can answer
Love
them
it.
any which way you want. But first question off the muscle.
Hmm.
Favorite hamburger?
My favorite hamburger. So this is related to like from a particular place, I assume.
You tell me.
So there is a place, there's a food truck near us called Smash Buddies, and they make some delightful, delicious smash burgers. 2 patties, they have a secret sauce, cheese, a bun, maybe some sauteed onions, no additional toppings. I could crush 2 of those easy. Great thing to do on a Friday night. There's a local brewery near us, and when that food truck is there, I never miss it.
Is it like around all year? Is it like a seasonal summer thing?
More of a seasonal summer thing because the brewery, they have different food trucks kind of stroll in Friday through Sunday type of deal, and it just varies who's going to be there. And so that food truck might only be there once a month, so I definitely make sure I scoot on over there when they're present.
So this is a part 2 to the question, not counting as number 2.
Yeah.
Pumpkin ale, seasonal ales, flavored
Mm,
beers. Any
yes.
preference, or do you think it's a bunch of hogwash and nonsense?
No, I love it. Especially the brewery that I go to. They have a pumpkin ale that is really, really good. I forget the actual name of it, but then they have they have a Christmas ale, which is my favorite Christmas ale that I've had to this point, and it's called Chimney Lube. So it's great. It's very, very tasty. And so yeah, big fan of the seasonal ales for sure.
So years ago, when I used to work in hospitality, I actually had food and beverage as a market segment for mine. So
Okay.
I had the regional sales manager for Sierra Nevada as a retainer for my hotel. So he and I got super close. And, he asked me one day, we're just on the phone, because we've been working all year. He goes, Alex, what do you drink? Like, drink vodka. He goes, no, 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 like beer. I sell beer. I don't sell vodka. And I was like, I drink Miller High Life. And he goes, do you drink Sierra Nevada? And I'm trying not to be impolite because I really can't stand IPAs.
Yeah.
And I'm like, pale ales and they don't get along. He goes, I want you to try this one, our seasonal celebration. That was the first IPA I ever liked.
Really?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And he gave me a case for Christmas. So I had no choice but to enjoy
Nice.
it. So every Christmas I always get like a 6 pack of celebration. It sits in my fridge for like 4 months.
Well, you also can't beat the champagne of beers. Miller High Life, that's good stuff too.
That's my go-to. That's
Yeah.
my I'm having a bad day and I have no money.
High Life, that's good. Yeah, I like it.
Second question. Peter Jackson and Miyamoto are in a vicious knife fight. Whose side do you take?
Oh my gosh. I don't Have you seen Miyamoto smile? That man is too kind to hold a knife. I just don't think that's
Or he
possible.
could be nuts. No offense,
Yeah,
Miyamoto-san, please.
yeah. I don't know. I Whose side do I take is different than who would win, right? So
I
who
only
I'm
want to
cheering
know
for.
whose side you would take. That's all I care about.
All right. Well, I'm probably a bigger Lord of the Rings fan than I am anything
But your
Miyamoto's put out.
pearls.
So I'm just gonna have to side with our man Peter Jackson because without him, we might not get. Well, the Frighteners 2 would probably be impossible because we love Michael J. Fox, but he's in a little bit rough shape right now. So um, I don't know. I think I'm gonna have to go with Peter Jackson.
Peter Jackson. Wow. Okay. I didn't expect that. You do
Yeah,
realize that kind of if Miyamoto were to lose in this vicious knife fight, our topic for today may not be a thing at all. You do realize that.
that's true. Yeah, the creators of Mario 3D. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there that wouldn't happen, but
So
yeah,
podcast is over, everybody. Thanks for coming.
it was a good time. Honestly, yeah.
All right, third question, final one. Now this one you have a choice. You can go with option A, option B, or option C.
Okay.
So, who is the better wingman in terms of going out for a night on the town with the boys?
Okay.
Samwise Gamgee, Kazuma Kiryu, or the wild card? Wild card being someone you choose, and why?
Wow. This is interesting and a question I never could have anticipated. So Samwise Gamgee, we have to kind of break this down a little bit. So Samwise is a little shy, clearly. So if this is pre taking Frodo to Mordor and carrying him on his back and coming back and asking Rosie to marry him because he had a lot more confidence, he was much more sure of himself and what he was capable of after that journey. If it's pre that journey, then Sam's completely off the table. If this is post Ring Destroyed, I feel like Sam would be quite the interesting wingman. And he probably would, take a few notes from Frodo's book in terms of him encouraging him to get up and dance with Rosie in the beginning of the films. So he's a possibility. The second person you mentioned, I think is from a series of games I've never played before,
Yakuza.
the Yakuza series. But outside looking in, suave, sure of himself, confident, all the things Sam probably wasn't before he went on the journey in Lord of the Rings. So, plus we'd probably be exploring Tokyo, which to me, I mean, I'd do anything to get on a plane and go back to Japan. So that's probably top of the list. And if I had to pick a third person, just to kind of shake things up a bit, I would throw in Duke Nukem, someone
Ooh,
who is obnoxiously confident and sure of himself, probably to his detriment,
probably get you thrown in
but
jail.
most likely. But I mean, come on, if Duke Nukem is probably going to take me to a place like Vegas. So we're going to really have a night to remember and a night that whatever happens stays there once we leave. So of all of those, I'm probably going to have to, and you're going to again have to pronounce the name because I already forgot how to.
Cosmic Kiryu.
Yep, I'm going to go with him because we're going to go to Tokyo. We're going to get into all kind of shenanigans. I might be part of the Yakuza after that. Who knows what it's going to take to get initiated into that, but that just sounds like good times.
Okay. That was truthfully the option I did not think you would go with. I thought you would definitely go with Rudy over there because he's Rudy, you know? You can't deny him.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of more thinking of Doug from 50 First Dates when I think of, Sean Astin, but yeah.
I always think of Rudy to this day. And even what during that scene of Lord of the Rings, I was with one of my friends and he was like, "You go, Rudy, you go." All right. So now we've gotten all of that silliness out of the way. We're going to go into what the topic is today, what this is, and why I am basically calling this sort of thing Video Games Gaiden, because it is really a side story to my own story. Not to say you are a side story, but we all have a different gaming background. We all have different stories. Different things hit differently for all of us, right? Now, admittedly, I'm a little bit older than you. I started more so on the Nintendo with 2D platformers. And I tend to gravitate towards 2D platformers because I think back to that point in my life, right? While you're growing up, your upbringing, you were more so in touch with the N64, if I recall, right?
Yep,
So
absolutely.
your perspective that I have is ultimately very different. So before we get into any of this stuff, I've already kind of explained my initial introduction to platformers in general was the original Super Mario Brothers. I got a Nintendo Entertainment System set as a kid with the orange zapper because at that point they were like, the original gray zapper looks a little sus, a little bit too much like a gun.
Yep.
It came with track and field and the pad, which was useless. It came with the gun, which was orange, and I pointed at the screen and I got a perfect score every time, including the skeet shooting. And then Super Mario Brothers. And as a kid, what I always found really interesting about it was the music and how it was all about motion. And even if I
Mm,
died, even if I couldn't figure out how to beat Bowser, which truthfully took me like 3 weeks, I still had fun replaying that same part over and over again because it was pulling me out of that real life stuff I was going through at the time.
mhm,
My dad was working, also used to work in hospitality, and he wasn't home a lot. So for the most part, it was my mom and my uncle. My mom had a full-time job. My uncle had a full-time job. And I would almost argue they got me a Nintendo to distract me, but it was also because a
mhm,
bunch of kids in my school had it, and it was the hot boy at the time, which is very different than how we look at game systems today. Some people look at them as entertainment. Some people look
mhm.
at them as an entertainment investment. Some people look at them as a Blu-ray player or just a streaming box. Um, but for me growing up, that was an escape from everything else. It was to pull me out of school. It was to pull me out of all that stress of being a little kid who, and I've mentioned this before. I don't know if I mentioned on any particular video, but I've mentioned it in passing. Even though I went to Catholic school, I actually couldn't read until close to the end of first grade
Mm, mhm.
because nobody noticed. So even though I was in school, and truthfully, I was failing everything because I couldn't read. I got a 0 on a test, and I thought that meant I got 0 wrong. Um, it was at that point that between after school, tutoring, and eventual summer school and everything else, just so I could progress to the second grade, playing a video game like a Super Mario Brothers was an escape for me
Mm.
as a little kid. And as an adult, it's still an escape. So it's kind of like how you grow up with it. But enough about me. Tell me about your introduction to platformers. What made it strike a chord with you, and what ultimately made you the crown prince of platform?
Yeah, so I love this topic in question, and for me, I have to go back to when I was really, really young, when I was probably about 3, 4, 5 years old. Some of my earliest memories, my dad had an NES, and it was this guest bedroom that we had upstairs. And I remember it very vividly because we had a waterbed of all things in there. And so I remember sitting on this waterbed as a very young kid, kind of retreating up there without my parents. And my dad had an NES, a small stack of games. So it was like Mario Brothers Duck Hunt, of course. He had Golf, just Golf, as it was titled back then.
Black box
Uh,
golf.
yes, exactly. Tecmo Super Bowl and Mario Brothers 3. And I have very vague, blurry memories of occasionally popping one of those cartridges in and playing those. But I don't remember really playing with my dad. I'm sure we did. But it wasn't until I got the N64, and this is another very foggy memory for me, which is bizarre because if you've watched my videos, if you listen to me on the podcast, I tend to have very vivid memories into the early 2000s, playing particular games, discovering certain things on the N64, PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. But the N64, I just have this very almost like dreamlike memory, almost like a third person view of opening up my N64 as a kid. And I remember my grandparents got my sister and I Diddy Kong Racing, Mario Party 2. We, of course, got Super Mario 64 and maybe like one or two other games. But it's just, again, a dreamlike sequence almost of opening that up. And after that, I just remember playing certain games with my family, my sister, and my dad specifically over the course of kind of my young adult life. But I don't remember that first time I played Mario 64. Like, I wish I could say, oh, that moment when I walked up to the castle for the first time and heard the music, but it really wasn't like that for me until the PlayStation 1. So, not to get all, into the sappy details of my life, but my parents got divorced when I was 5.
Mhm.
And so this created an interesting dynamic where my parents lived within 15 minutes of one another. And so I lived, or I would kind of, my parents had shared custody. So I'd go to my mom's, I'd go to my dad's, but my mom was dating this guy at the time, and he had a PlayStation 1, and he had games like Cool Borders and Battle Arena Toshinden and just a random handful of games. But he also had Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. And when I played that game for the first time, that was when I was just really struck by these open environments. I loved the characters wandering around these levels and being able to find and collect all the different rupees and stuff like that. And so one of my most prized possessions, this wasn't his copy. My mom, they separated, which was for the best. And my mom eventually got me a copy of my own. So I have my original copy of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage. And, the classic question of if your house is burning down or your game room specifically, I don't think I'm running to my game room, honestly, if my house is burning down. I have other priorities to be trying to seek out. But if it was games specifically, Spyro 2, my original copy of Kingdom Hearts would probably be like the two things that I would get because the memories that I have tied to that is not just me getting lost and escaping into those different worlds. It was my sister sitting on the couch with me, and when she was watching me when my mom was working her second job in the evening, my sister would make me dinner and I would play Spyro 2. And so playing that game for me really, I think, kickstarted my love of 3D platformers before I even really understood what that genre was or began associating certain games to it, like Banjo Kazooie, eventually stuff like Jak and Daxter and Ratchet and Clank. But that game, I think, really, again, solidified my love of the genre and kind of kickstarted my obsession with games of the genre going forward.
So would you say that Ripto's Rage is the 3D platformer you basically benchmark all other 3D platformers off of?
I think it's one of them. I was thinking about this when you sent that list of questions, and one of the questions that you had was something like that. And I would say I view 3D platformers in like eras, right? So like Spyro 2 is that first one that I would say is the benchmark for me. And then eventually one of the earliest games I got for the PlayStation 2 was Jak and Daxter and the Precursor Legacy. And so those two games specifically, I think kind of carved out in my mind this idea of what I want 3D platformers to be. I love Mario 64 maybe just as much as anyone that played the game when it first released. But I don't like that the game spits you out after you get a star. I want to keep going, right? I want to keep exploring. And that's what I loved about stuff like Spyro, Banjo-Kazooie, Jak and Daxter, like walking on Sentinel Beach for the first time and just getting to just explore, not knowing what was around the corner. venturing too deep and going into the water and that crazy fish eats you alive, right? Like I want to explore every square inch of these levels. And so Jack and Daxter and Spyro 2 really for me, I think are those benchmark 3D platformers in my mind of like, sure, there's different ways you can approach just like JRPGs, shooters, all those different genres, different ways you can approach them. But in my mind, I'm always trying to seek and find those 3D platformers that make me feel the same way I did when I played Jack and Daxter and Spyro 2 for the first time.
See, and it's funny you say that. And this is where I said there's a little bit of a difference between the two of us because me growing up with 2D platformers, I tend to look at everything from a linear perspective, right? So Mario 64 for me is the 3D platformer I derive all other 3D platformers from, right? Like that's my benchmark. But
Hmm.
and you already touched on this, it spits you out at the end. I have a
Yeah.
linear progression, and each star, there it's like an episode, right? It's like, Ba-Bomb King, and that means you go
Yep.
fight the Ba-Bomb King. And if you try to jump ahead, the game says, "No, you gotta do it in order." So for me, that is actually a better thing, and that's where, like, a game like, I'll even bring up Super Lucky's Tale, where
Hmm.
it's very much a nice breezy point A to point B game. Difference is, even though there's levels, you can go left, you can go right. There's a degree of freedom that the game gives you within its constraints, as
Hmm.
opposed to like a fully open world 3D game. And I'm going to use ukulele in this instance because even with you touching on what was going on with your family situation at the time when you were playing the Spyro game, when my mom passed away a few years ago,
Hmm.
um, and me trying to juggle, arrangements and, trying to basically offer my support to my dad and people asking me 50,000 questions and whatnot. Um, I didn't even order this from Limited Run originally. I bought it on at Best Buy because it was on sale. I bought a copy of Ukulele, which
Yeah.
had a bunch of drama in and of itself, between Kickstarters and people saying it wasn't all that was cracked up to be or whatnot. That game could not have come at a better time for me
Mm.
because it gave me enough of that open world part and it also touched enough on Mario 64 that I was able just to pull myself out of all that sorry, mom, out of all that crap and
Yeah.
actually just think. And even Katie, my wife, she personally can't stand the game. She likes the sequel because it reminds her of Donkey Kong Country, which is what she
Yep.
played mostly growing up, followed by Mario 64, which is her favorite game of all time, and the game she derives all 3D platformers from because that's her jam.
Yep.
And for the record, she'll also platinum the hell out of any of them. Just give her enough time and she'll do it. But me playing that and it brought me back to the 90s. It
Mm.
made me remember like my mom coming into my room as a kid, going like, "Oh, you're playing Mario?" Meanwhile, I'm playing Sonic the Hedgehog. And I'm like, "No, mom, this is Sonic." And she goes, "Oh, on
Yeah.
the Nintendo, right?" I'm like, "No, mom, this is a Genesis." And she goes, "Well, it's a tape." And I go, "No, actually, this is Sonic CD." You're betting 1,000, mom. Like, come on, yeah,
Yeah.
you're getting it all wrong. But that was the whole thing, and it's like a joke even today with my wife and I. She goes, "How are those Nintendo tapes treating you?" Meanwhile, I'm like looking at like MVS stuff because I keep threatening to buy one,
Yeah.
which will never happen. Or I'll be at the courthouse with divorce papers. But regardless, I do find that really interesting that is it one for one? No, but we actually do have some common ground where we both kind of lean on a 3D platformer as like kind of a comfortability thing.
Hmm.
I don't think I'd be running in the house to grab my copy of ukulele. That would
Yeah.
definitely be reserved for my copy of Lunar Silver Star or Silver Star Complete on the PS1 because I'm more of a JRPG guy, which I attribute to my uncle. But in terms of platformers, like again, as much as people dog on it, I'm like, it's actually a really good game. And I would say
Hmm.
that is what motivated me to look into games like A Hat in Time, which
Mm.
I would say is closer to a Mario 64 than not.
Yep.
Um, but I'm also struggling to think of any other game that is similar to that, which is also why I asked you because I know you know this better than I do. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, like on the ukulele side of things, because that game also kind of entered my life at a really interesting time where through my college years, and it's chronicled a lot or quite a bit over the course of my YouTube channel, but I really, while I was still probably more in tune with gaming news during my college years, it was a time where I really backed away from playing a lot of games outside of stuff on my DS and my 3DS, just because the portability aspect was just kind of so conducive to college life. But as big a fan of Banjo Kazooie as I was as a kid, I really didn't follow the Kickstarter for Ukulele, and it wasn't until I had graduated college, gotten married. It was like 2018, 2019. I got a PlayStation 4, went into GameStop, and I remember talking to the clerk and saying, "Hey, I love RPGs and I love 3D platformers. Any recommendations?" And she pulled off Ni no Kuni 2, Revenant Kingdom off the shelf, and Ukulele. And the moment I saw Ukulele, I was like, immediately all of the memories, seeing the Kickstarter and all the news came flooding in. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is the Banjo Kazooie spiritual successor, all that good stuff. Let me give this a try. And I went home and I played it and I platinumed it in 3 days. Like I just completely binged the
Freaking
game,
maniac. Jesus.
played the heck out of it, absolutely loved it. And, in our inner circles, it's almost become a meme at this point, how much admiration I have for that game. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it kind of really captures the magic of what made games in the 90s and especially the late 90s from the 3D platformers that came from that era so special, even if it didn't maybe match the expectations of so many people that went into it. But I have a great fondness for it because I think the PS3 and Xbox 360 era, like I could ask you, Alex, what are some of the best 3D platformers between the PS1 and N64? And you'd probably respond and say, well, how much time do you have? If I asked you, what are some of the best 3D platformers of the Xbox 360 and PS3 era? You'd probably say, well, the Ratchet and Clank games on PS3, but like outside of that, I have no idea. Because the indie games and trying to capture on the nostalgia of the 16-bit and 8-bit platformers were so prevalent during that era, there really weren't many 3D platformers to speak of during the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation. So getting into the PS4 era and playing ukulele, I was like, oh my gosh, this genre lives on. This is amazing. And then we got stuff like A Hat in Time, and more recently stuff like Tinykin, New Super Lucky's Tale, and even some off the beaten path games like Pumpkin Jack, which is
That's a good
a
one. That is a good one.
really, really fun game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's cool to see the genre really live on, I think, especially within the PS4, PS5 generation.
What I think was to the detriment of ukulele, I think, or Kickstarters in general. And I'm going to use 3D platformers because it is a genre that is deeply rooted in nostalgia for
Hmm.
many of us within, our age category and, even going back to the glorious days of the YouTube gaming community. A Kickstarter from the group that made the original Banjo Kazooie. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Just because the band wants to get back together and do things the way they did 20 years ago doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate 100% today, right?
Yes.
I don't think Mighty Number Nine is a good example because that just has way more problems than it's worth. But me playing ukulele, for instance, I played it and I'm like, okay, this feels like an N64 game to me. Some people are like, oh, the quality of life, oh, the drift, oh, the lag, oh, the this, oh, the that, oh, the frame rate dip. I'm like, I grew up with this. I personally had no problem with it. But to your point too, when you have indie developers who, more power to them, try to tap on what they grew up on, and then they try to make it more modern with
Hmm.
a lot more QOL stuff going on, they get it just as hard because
Hmm.
it's not respectful to the source material, because it's blatantly ripping off of this, because it's blatantly ripping off of that. And I kind of just scratch my head. It's very much, eat your cake, have your cake and eat it too. And I'm like, guys, pick one. Like you either like it or you don't like it, right? And some people, one thing I did find that I thought was interesting was I played through A Hat in Time sight unseen, basically just saw a video and was like, OMG, this looks like Mario 64 and it's cute and funny and she has a razor scooter. Like this is ridiculous,
Hmm.
Played through it and I had a blast. Physical copy came out, bought it. Had no interest, it's still unopened. I just wanted to physically own it. I enjoyed it so much. And I was thinking, oh, if they put it on PS5, I'll definitely pick it up again. I'll get rid of my PS4 copy because I'd like on PS5. And out of curiosity, I decided, let me see what the difference is if there would be any. And everybody's like, well, the PS4 version's inferior. And I'm like, wait. Why? Like, oh, because it doesn't run 60 frames per second. I had no idea.
Hmm.
It didn't hinder my enjoyment at all. And I think that's where, we're in an age where you get analysis paralysis when it comes to these games, right? If you make
Yeah.
if you make a game using the constraints, and I think it's called Cavern of Dreams, it's on the Switch. I think Super Rare Games made it. They basically made a 3D platformer in the constraints of the N64, and it's reviewed very
Hmm.
well. A lot of folks seem to enjoy it. I'm waiting for my physical copy to come in because I'm a glutton for punishment. Um, but me watching it, I'm like, some people are like, "Oh, this looks old." Like that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
And I feel like, is it an age thing? Maybe, but I more so I think it's a general expectation thing because we have had this renaissance of 3D platformers and people want it 2024 style, but
Hmm.
looking 1990s style. That's how I see it. I don't know if you feel any different about that.
No, I think I feel similarly, and I think one of the key differences is for games of the Super Nintendo and even NES era, that 8 and 16-bit style of platformer, whether it's graphically, mechanically, the way the game controls, I think those types of games tend to age much more gracefully than stuff on the PS1 and N64 because you're getting into these 3D worlds. People are trying to figure out analog controls and how to navigate that for the first time. And so that just mechanically in the way the game plays doesn't always again age as well as some of those games on the Super Nintendo, like Donkey Kong Country. I think you ask 100 people what do they prefer, Impossible Layer, or the original Ukulele. I think the great majority is going to say Impossible Layer. I mean, I know just about everyone in my inner circle prefers Impossible Layer over Ukulele, and I think it really just comes down to personal preference. I think a lot of people that maybe, and I won't say a lot of people, I'm going to say just my own experience, right? I grew up on the N64 and PS1, so naturally I'm going to prefer Ukulele over Impossible Layer. But if I was a few years older or grew up like in the late 80s, early 90s and had a Super Nintendo and played Donkey Kong Country at a young age, I might prefer Impossible Layer over Ukulele. So I think it comes down to personal preference, and I just think those 3D games of the 90s and early 2000s might not age as gracefully as the Donkey Kong Countries of the world.
Yeah, and for the record, I actually, other than Donkey Kong Country 1, can't stand the rest of the series.
Really? Okay.
I find them so, I mean, they're difficult and I get it. That's part of it. It's a remnant from the Battletoads days, but those games are just too freaking hard. There's no reason
Yeah.
for it. There's no reason for it. Like like Cranky Kong, I don't know how he lived so long. Like I just don't get it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but yeah, so I think this kind of ties into where we're doing with the game du jour, which for those of you, depending on how I title this, it's a League of Legends story, The Song of Nunu. Now, for the record, I do not play League. I know nothing about League. I believe Rusty knows nothing about League either.
Nothing.
So some of you guys may know and be like, yeah, and scrub through the video. That's fine. Whatever. Fuck you. But more importantly, this was a project that Riot Games actually started a few years ago with the idea of trying to expand the League of Legends reach into different genres of video games because MOBAs, for lack of a better word, are very intimidating to get into. I
Hmm.
personally tried Heroes of the Storm from Blizzard some time ago. I gave up after like a week. I was like, this makes no sense to me. This whole it's I'm an idiot with this stuff. It's like tower defense, and I hate tower defense inherently. So the idea of having different lanes and strategies and picking a hero and different build, I was like, It's enough." Like I thought it was a Diablo style game. I was really excited, and I was horribly disappointed. But I think Riot Games realizes that they have all their eggs in one basket, and they have a beautiful world filled with lore, which I went into after playing this game to the point where I'm not interested in playing the game. I'm not interested in watching it, but I'm interested in digesting other forms of media pertaining to it. Graphic
Mm.
novels, if there was a TV show, animated shorts, stuff like that I'd watch. But they did an action RPG. They did a sort of roguelike game, I believe. They did a turn-based RPG, And then they tapped Tequila Works to make the Song of Nunu, which is, for today's topic, a 3D platformer. And Tequila Works, I'm a big fan of them. They've made games like Guilt, which is also a 3D platform with a little bit of stealth elements. It was trapped on Stadia for like 5 years. Now it's available on everything. They also did a brilliant VR sequel game to Groundhog Day, which I highly recommend if you love the
Hmm.
movie. The game is just as good. It's a good bookend to that. And from what I understand, they also did, I think, the Sexy Brutale, which is like a time travel mystery isometric game.
And also Rhyme.
Rhyme, that's another one too.
Hmm.
That one I have not played.
Yeah.
But so for us to choose this game, it didn't come out of the blue. I basically went through my backlog and games I was interested in playing, and I sent Rusty a list and said, "You pick one as long as you own it, plan to own it, or we've never played it before." And ultimately, what made you want to play the Song of Nunu?
Because the only other option was Gex, and I thought that it probably was best if we did Song of Nunu instead. No, you sent me a great list of games, but this is something that I'd had wishlisted for years. I was kind of following the development cycle of it, and it honestly just had completely escaped me. It was just sitting buried in my wish list after it had come out, and I'd kind of forgotten about it entirely. But I love games that, to me, seem to graphically, thematically, kind of they seem almost like PS2 era type games.
Mhm.
And so much of Song of Nunu, I just was like, this feels like a forgotten gem on the PS2 with like the tack and the power of jujus and those types of like weird licensed 3D platformers, even stuff like Ty the Tasmanian Tiger that probably didn't get as much love as some of the other platformers at the time, or Vex, if you've ever played Vex, a weird Jack and Daxter style 3D platformer on the PS2. And that's what kind of immediately captured my attention. And candidly, I did not even know on the outset that like League of Legends was even tied to this. I thought it was
Really?
just the song of Nunu. It wasn't until like I actually installed the game and started playing it and actually seeing the title screen. I'm like, oh, this is associated with League of Legends. I had no idea. So I would say the graphical style and just like, wow, this looks like a PS2 era game. I want to play this.
Which is funny considering you said, that PS2 era had some really great 3D platformers on it. PS3, which I initially more so attribute towards it as like that weird in between. Like I could see
Yeah.
this as it's available on PS2, Xbox, Xbox 360, PS3.
What has kind of almost a Majin the Forsaken Kingdom, like
Yeah,
enslaved Odyssey of the West type of vibe to it
yeah.
too. So yeah, I could see that.
Minus Andy Circus.
Yeah.
But But when I saw this game, what initially jumped out at me, besides that similar aesthetic, it had a very Pixar look to it, and that's very much a Tequila Works thing. And
Hmm.
I'm not the biggest Pixar fanatic, I'll say, but when I see that art style, it's not something like I go, "Oh, it's another Pixar movie." I'll be like, "Okay, I'll watch this." And then
Hmm.
next thing I know, I've watched Inside Out like 5 times back to back. And my wife is a social worker, and she's like, "This is actually very good. They should play this in colleges. Like, this is actually what they teach us for growing children, like in terms of understanding emotions." I'm like, I like the movie. I didn't realize I was getting my learn on, but with this, it's just something about the way that Nunu smiles, like with like the missing tooth and like the spacing and everything. I'm like, that has Pixar written all over it.
For
And
sure.
and I have a friend who works in the animation industry, and when I showed it to him, he was like, "Oh, dude," he's like, "Do you know how many pencil tests and how many tests or portfolios I've seen with stuff like this in it? It's like this is not what sells, but this is what people want when they're going for a specific aesthetic."
Kind of
And
gravitate towards that style. Yeah.
yeah, and I was like, "Oh, well, the game's pretty good too." And he's like, "Oh, it's a game." He's like, "I thought it was a movie because I told him it was pertaining to League of Legends." And he was even
Oh
saying
wow.
like, "Oh yeah, because they're doing like a whole big media push." Because he had auditioned for them way back in the day doing character design, but he never went into it. But oddly
Mm.
enough, I looked up uh, Nunu's character class. He's a mage tank,
Really?
which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But when
Yeah.
playing the game, I was like, wow, this it actually does make sense. Like he's kind of like I thought he was like a support bardy thing, with the
Yeah.
music, but no, he's a tank because of the Yeti.
So okay, so the Willump is like his partner character
Yeah,
even
he
in
rides
League
around
then.
on him.
Okay, that makes sense then. The tank does make sense at that
But
point
I was
then.
like, wait, so he's a mage tank, not like a bard tank. It's like, yeah, no,
Yeah.
like he heals. And I think the other thing is like if he dies, he comes back to life
Mhm.
because of the blue or something.
Okay.
Then I
Yeah.
was like, okay, this is like make me think way too much about this game. So um I was like, let me just stick to the game itself. And overall, I think our initial first impression, we've already kind of spoiled it. We both really enjoyed this, but what was the first thing that jumped out to you in terms of picking this game? Like, what made you go besides, oh, this has been in my backlog? What made you go, ooh, this looks right up the alley?
I just knew that I was gonna be getting something that like I couldn't anticipate in terms of gameplay because I really didn't watch any gameplay going in. I'd seen some, rough cuts initially, trailers, things like that, but I really didn't watch any long form gameplay sessions. And with something like Gex or even like platformers I already mentioned, like New Super Lucky's Tale, Ukulele, I kind of know what I'm getting into. With this, I was like, this could be more action adventure. This could be like open world 3D collectathon. I don't know what I'm getting into, and that sense of curiosity really kind of got the best of me, which is why I wanted to pick this one.
Yeah. So for me personally, me looking at it, I thought it was going to be more open world. This game
Mm,
is pretty much, I'll say, pretty linear, which for me is fine.
hmm
That hit like, one of my whole like prerequisites in terms of a platformer I enjoy. I know where the end is. But there was in terms of the platforming itself, I kind of felt like this was more like Uncharted than
Yes,
anything, which is not a bad thing. As somebody who isn't really that hot on the Uncharted games, I prefer Tomb Raider by comparison. She did it
that's fair.
first. But I think it was just like the dialogue that Nunu has with Willem going forward and everything too. Like
hmm
it was very much like Nate and Sully like going back and forth, except as opposed to having a gruff old Irish dude. We had a series of grunts, but a whole conversation was taking place, and
Yeah.
Willem kind of fills in that role of like a more senior guardian, so to speak, based on the way Nunu responds to him. And,
hmm
that is very much like, a rated G Disney movie sort of thing.
For sure. Yep.
So for
But I
me,
mean,
for me,
go ahead.
it's
Sorry.
really like, so for me, this was really just like something as a kid I would have watched. Like if I was a kid today in 2024 and this was like a 3D, Pixar film, I would have eaten this all up, you know?
hmm
Like this
Yeah.
could have been a licensed game as far as I'm concerned. Like for
Yep.
a movie, not for another series as a spinoff?
hmm Yeah. No, I had very similar feelings and very much Pixar for sure, but I almost got like DreamWorks vibes from the
Mm,
game. How to Train Your Dragon specifically, like some of the music in those films, I felt like was present in this game. And I also kind of attribute it to Avatar: The Last Airbender, not the
that's
M
a
Night
good one.
Shyamalan nonsense, but like Nunu's voice actually kind of sounded like Aang. It's been a while
Yeah,
since I've gone through the cartoon anime, but like he also was just very inquisitive, curious, kind of a smartass like Aang as well in Avatar. So when I was going through the game again, just kind of big Avatar: The Last Airbender and How to Train Your Dragon kind of energy with the storytelling, the character interactions, and certainly the music.
yeah. I didn't even pick up on The Last Airbender. I love that show so much, and I watched that way after it finished. Like, I'm talking after Korra is when I watched it, which is when everybody said, "No, no, don't watch Korra," because
Yeah.
it did a lot of different things. But I liked it. But yeah, no, Last Airbender definitely, especially with Aang. That's a very good point. I did not pick up on that. Huh.
Yeah.
This is why I picked you as a co-host for this sort of thing.
But getting back to the platforming, I will say 30 minutes into the game, I was a little taken aback of like, oh no, wait a second. This is much more action adventure than 3D platforming,
Yeah.
right? There's quite a bit more puzzles than I had anticipated. And the running joke in our inner circle is Rusty hates puzzles. He's completely inept at being able to solve them, which is sort of true. And I even sent you a message that like this one puzzle in the game, like I lost my mind. But for the most part, the puzzle solving I think is pretty simple. It's environmental type puzzle solving, and then oftentimes using this flute, which we'll probably get into here, using that to solve puzzles as well. And just on that note, I thought the AI was surprisingly really good with Willem. Like I never ran into any issues. You're never controlling both characters, really. You're only controlling Nunu, and I felt like I was just surprised how well the game controlled. I never ran into any bugs of like, oh no, this isn't working. I need to restart my save. But yeah, I think just kind of setting that expectations for folks that might be looking for a 3D collectathon platformer based on League of Legends lore. It isn't quite that game, but I wouldn't let that scare you away because I am very much someone that just wants those 3D collectathon platformers, and I still thoroughly enjoyed this game. And I think it really is those character interactions in the story that kind of draws you in and kind of keeps you along and invested for the whole ride.
Yeah, and touching on, I mean, personally, I like environmental puzzles, but at one point while I was playing through the game, I was thinking, "Oh no, this, he, he's not gonna like this at all." Then I got to one
Yeah.
puzzle and I was like, "Oh no, I was like, he's gonna tap out at this part." And sure enough, you messaged me and you're like, "This effing puzzle," and I was like, "I knew it. It was that exact." I didn't want to tell you it was the exact puzzle. I was like, "He's gonna get frustrated at this one. I already know."
Yeah, I
Meanwhile, I
did.
solved it in like 2 minutes because I just got like, "Oh, this is easy." Dun, 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 dun.
That's awesome.
And even Katie was like, she's because she was sitting next to me as I was reading it, and I was like, I knew he was gonna have difficulty with this one, and I showed her the picture, and she goes, "Don't be a smartass." I'm like, I finished it in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But
It's funny because that particular puzzle, I do like those types of things because you find similar ones in like Uncharted and stuff, but I just couldn't figure it out. But I eventually got it.
one thing I will say about this game, though, like I know with some 3D platformers, whenever there is a boss fight, it's an event, right? Like there aren't that
Mm-hmm.
many, they aren't that challenging. It's more so meant to create a spectacle to want you to keep playing. And this
Yeah.
game does not have a lot of boss fights. It has, like, arguably, I'll say 2,
Mm-hmm.
but they're both really cool for what they do
Yeah.
because there's a purpose to the story for them. It's not just, arbitrary MacGuffin giant thingy standing in your way that is trying to
Yeah.
stop you from progressing. There's, like, a reason behind these specific bosses. And I thought
Yeah.
that actually not only played into the story, but the first one I'm thinking of with the being vague for a reason. With the bear,
Mm-hmm.
it really ties into a little bit of character development there because you're given a mystery involving Nunu right at the beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
it's nothing wacky. Like if you read or watched enough movies or consumed enough media with this sort of story, you know what's coming.
Yes,
And
for sure.
everybody knows, except Nunu, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And you specifically in the conversation see, okay, yeah, I was right. This is what's going down. But the presentation was so good.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, that's really cool. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, oh well, like I guess that's what it is, right? Um, like the example I will give right off the bat is like, I'll use Dragon Ball Z for example. Everybody knows like every season Goku's gonna fight somebody that's incredibly stronger than him because that's the nature of the series. But then when you get into Super and you have Frieza resurrected, who a lot of people will say was probably the most villainous out of everybody, there's a reason behind it
Mm-hmm.
because Vegeta, for instance, has gotten the most character development throughout the whole series, yet has been shit on for 20 years. Frieza was absent for like 15 of that. And all of a sudden, he's going through this very weird, almost redemption arc, but not really, kind of. But you don't see
Yeah.
it, but you see it coming, but you don't see it coming. Is basically what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, for sure. And even like even a simpler example is just going back to the Pixar example of something like Toy Story, right? Like in the beginning of the movie, you introduce Buzz Lightyear, him and Woody aren't getting along. You know by the end of the movie they're going to be the best of friends.
Yeah,
And in the beginning of this game, it almost pulls an Uncharted where it kind of shows you an event that is going to happen towards the end of the game and then circles back to, okay, introduce Willump and Nunu. They're going on this little mysterious adventure, and there's like these kind of mysterious dreamlike sequences that they're kind of unraveling the story. But again, You're not quite sure, but they're feeding you these breadcrumbs along the way. You know what's going to happen, but like any good Pixar movie, by the end, you might be getting a little teary eyed and just it's just a really heartfelt, charming, wholesome adventure. And that's why I keep going back to the PS2 era of just kind of like licensed platformers. And when you tie that together with Pixar films and characters, it's just, yeah, it was refreshing to play a game like this in 2024.
So, next question. Did you get choked up at the end or no?
I did, yeah. Well,
W-
there were a couple times, and maybe this is like I'm gonna be a father in 2 months, and I'm just maybe a bit more sensitive now. Now that I'm gonna be a dad, but like there were a couple, and I wish I would have wrote down some of the quotes, but for avoiding spoilers, probably wouldn't have made sense anyways. The interactions with Willump and Nunu almost brought me to tears a number of different times. And I think what's so unique about the game is Willump is a character that can't speak, but he's kind of like Chewbacca in the sense that whenever he is emoting and making noises, Nunu knows what he's saying and what he's communicating. And I think their ability in the game to have this yeti of sorts to be able to emote and evoke emotion in the player, even though we don't often know what he's saying, I think is just a testament to how well the game develops both characters along. I mean, it only takes like 5 to 8 hours to beat. So by the end, I absolutely was pretty choked up.
So, as a kid, if you were to play this as, 8-year-old Rusty, do you think you would have had a similar emotional response, or do you think you would have just gone through the motions?
I think I probably would have because my parents probably even at a young age would have described me as a sensitive person. Um, I remember one of the first memories I have seeing a movie in theaters was The Iron Giant,
Oh
and I
god.
remember
That one's
being there,
rough. That one's rough.
wi- being there with my dad and my sister, and at the tail end, if you know what happens in The Iron Giant, no spoilers, I suppose, but I cried. And even at the end, when things kind of come together and I guess spoiler alert for a movie that came out 20 plus years ago, the Iron Giant doesn't die and he comes back together. The pieces start coming back together. I cried the whole way home because it was like, first I thought he died and I was tearing up, but then I found out he did it. And then it was just like, like just waterworks for days. So I think if I played this game as a kid, yeah, I absolutely would have gotten emotional.
See, and I find that funny because as a kid, I would have had no emotional response to this whatsoever. It would have been just
Really?
very matter of fact. The first time I ever saw anything animated that generated an emotional response to me from me was All Dogs Go to Heaven,
Oh, wow.
the
Yeah.
movie. I saw that in the theater and I was with my uncle. And I've seen Oliver and Company, I've seen all the Disney movies. No emotional response whatsoever. There's one particular scene in that movie. I just started bawling.
Mm,
And I remember he looked at me and he thought like I like hit my head on the seat or something. He was like, "What's wrong with you?" Like,
yeah.
and it was this scene where there was a cat that had no tail, and for whatever reason, it just triggered me completely. And
Mm,
he had to take me out of the theater. Like,
really?
he couldn't console me whatsoever. He brought me home, and my mom's like, "Oh, how was the that was short. That was like 20 minutes. Why are you guys back?" And he was like, Alex just started bawling. And my mom's like, he never cries. And he
Mm,
was like, I don't know what happened. Years later, he bought me the movie on VHS. Well, not years later, but when it came out on VHS, he bought it for me. And he's like, okay, let's watch it again, this time at home. And I cried at the exact same spot. And then at that point, he realized, oh,
mm.
he doesn't like seeing animals in distress.
Wow.
Yeah. So but like as I got older, like no emotional response. But now that I'm in my, well, I was in my late 30s, now I'm 40. I see anything, Katie's like, oh boy, here he goes. Here he goes. He's like, I can hear
Yeah.
it. He's fighting back. Like I cried at the end of Yakuza 6, like bawling. Like I had to pause the game and take a lap around the block. Like I couldn't take it.
Yeah.
This game definitely elicited an emotional response for me. As a kid, I don't think it would have.
Yeah.
And I think that's because Nunu has such a, I'll say, personality as
Mhm.
opposed to just being like a pet, which I
Yeah.
feel like the marketing kind of advertised it as. But when you
Mhm.
play the actual game, you're right. He's more like a Chewbacca.
Yeah.
He's not a sidekick.
Yep.
He's an integral part to the game itself, which honestly, his development is really good, and I didn't see it coming.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but I really enjoyed it. But one thing I did neglect to ask you, how did you play this? Did you play this on the PS5 or?
So interesting. The reason I played this on the Xbox, and the only reason why I did, and we talked about this before we actually started recording, it is surprisingly really easy to capture gameplay footage. So if I wanted to use any footage for like a future video, or if you want to B-roll anything, I can provide you with footage to kind of capture alongside this video. It's supremely easy to get really high quality video without actually using a capture card or having to do any of that. So you literally just click a button on your controller and you capture footage. Literally the only reason why I played this on Xbox. Otherwise, I would have played it on PlayStation because I would have loved to have gotten the platinum trophy on this. Which, who's to say I won't buy it on sale and double dip and eventually get the platinum trophy on this?
Yeah, because I was almost hoping you played it on Switch because I watched some gameplay after the fact and I was like, wow, this has like Vaseline all over it. It's like it
Yeah.
looks like a 3DS game, which for what this is, looks really charming and it
Yeah, could
works.
have been a good 3DS game.
It
Yeah.
works really well, and that's partially, and this is my fault here, but that's why I wanted this particular question on here because I think sometimes the method of play affects your enjoyment level. You know,
Mm,
I wanted the fidelity, so I went PS5, right? But you wanted to record, so you went Xbox, which we'll say is the same. But if I wanted the portability, to that point, if I was like a college student on the constant go, maybe I'm taking a graphical hit, but if I grew up playing 3DS, you get a double nostalgia kick, potentially.
I think this would have felt really at home on the 3DS. Now, I never would have thought of that, but that would have, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of how I saw it, but I think for me, if I had played this, if I was more in tune with 3D platformers in like, we'll say late grammar school, early high school, and I had played this game, I think I would have finished it. I really would have enjoyed it, but I don't think I would have appreciated it the same way I appreciate it now as Alex today, because 3D platformers are going through a renaissance, I think, to your
Hmm.
point. And I think it's refreshing because if the big dudes and dudettes aren't going to make them as they used to, and it's all about like, I'll say I can't even think of one off the top of my head. Like they announce a Crash Bandicoot, I think 4 or 5, I think.
Hmm.
Everybody gets excited and then it comes out and nobody's happy, right?
Yep.
Something like this where it's independent from a source material that is targeting a specific audience that doesn't necessarily play League, it can only do well if it's made
Yeah.
well. I do understand their farming sim one, their cozy version for, I think it's Beetle or Bandle, didn't do as well because of technical issues, but that was for the different developer altogether. But having played a bunch of Tequila Works games in the past, me seeing that particular development team working on this one, I was like, oh, it's gonna be good. Even if it's bad, it's good.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and I don't know, I don't think this is the point you're making, but it kind of triggered a thought in my mind of like, I've not played Super Mario Odyssey. I mean, I played it like 1 or 2 hours, but like,
my
I
pearls.
know, I know, but like, and I know it's gonna be great. I've heard a lot of the music. It's exceptional. It's everything you want in a 3D Mario game. It innovates in all the ways you would anticipate Nintendo to continue to push the envelope with their 3D Mario games. But like Kirby and the Forgotten Land, I thought it was fine. I just Mario 3D World, it was great. But like I'm at a point, I guess, in my life and for all the games that I played over the course of my life that I look forward to playing Tinykin. I look forward to discovering something like Song of Nunu so much more than the next blockbuster 3D Mario or 3D Kirby game. Now, I will say, Nintendo needs to get their act together and either remake Donkey Kong 64 or like Donkey Kong 64 2 because I can't believe we don't have a 3D Donkey Kong at this point. But like the point I'm trying to make is like I just look forward to these types of games so much more because to my point earlier, I never know what to expect when I'm getting into it, but I know what what I'm gonna get out of the next 3D Kirby and out of the next 3D Mario. And that probably sounds um, insane to certain people.
They're a little
Uh,
judgy, but
yeah, but like that's just kind of where I'm at. Of like these types of games excite me so much more because I typically walk away much more surprised than I do with 3D Mario. Of course, it's going to be 9.5 out of 10, 10 out of 10. It's going to be great, but I like games like this. So,
so for me to be a little hyperbolic here, it's like going to see a J.J. Abrams movie. You go in there with like a bottle of Jack Daniels and you go, we're going to do a shot every time we see a lens flare. Like you already know
yeah,
it's going to happen, you know?
exactly. Yeah.
So
And that's and I want to be clear though, like cuz there might be some people watching this that don't know me. Like I'm not some like weirdo hipster gamer that's like I don't like Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey or anything like that. It's more just we've played so many of these types of games before and we don't get many games like Song of Nunu or Pumpkin Jack nowadays. Not that those games are the same level of quality of Mario Odyssey, of course not, but I think they're a refreshing take on the genre.
I read this very interesting article some time ago, and I did mean to bookmark it as like an add-on for later, but I completely forgot. Basically, it touched on nostalgia, recapturing the joys of youth, and the fact that there was no your responsibility was to go to school and presumably pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nostalgia used to be considered a disease, right? Like for, folks with homesickness, all that sort of thing. It was considered like an incurable disease. I would
Mm-hmm.
argue to an extent that depending on my day, it is, but that's also tied to the fact of like a euphoric feeling, right? Like the first
Mm-hmm.
time, from your burger truck, right? The first time you went, you're like, OMG, this is the best thing I've ever eaten. And you keep going back because you enjoy it, but it's never going to be that same initial hit that you first had.
Absolutely.
So when you play a Mario game, in my case, Super Mario Brothers, you play the first one, you love it. You play the second one, you're a little confused because it's Doki Doki Panic, but you still
Mm-hmm.
enjoy it. You play the third game and you go, OMG, this is so hard, but it's different. And that's where I think Nintendo and Miyamoto succeed. They try to reinvent Mario in every single game. So it's
Mm-hmm.
unique every single time, but you also have that expectation of what you're going to get. There's going to be a water level, there's going to be an ice level. If you see a bunch of penguins, you know it's only a matter of time before you go down a slide.
Yep.
There's a little bit of checkboxy stuff going in there. So even with a game like Song of Nunu, does it check some of those boxes? Yeah, because they're using it as an influence. But the difference is going in, you don't know if it's going to happen or not.
Yeah,
So when it does happen, it's kind of like a welcome surprise. Like there
it
are
is.
collectibles in this game. There's not a lot. And when I
Mm-hmm.
found one, probably 5 hours into the game, I was like right at the end. And I got a trophy for it. I was like, oh, I had no idea this was a thing. This is cute. And then I finished the game. Didn't go back and do them, but I also didn't have that expectation of having to get 10 jiggies to get to the next level or whatever the case may be.
I felt the same way, and I discovered some of the collectibles earlier on, and I started getting achievements instead of trophies because I played on Xbox. But never once was I feeling like that need or desire to like oh wow, I need to explore every single nook and cranny of this game. And I think that's partially because I kind of recalibrated my expectations when I started playing of like, oh no, wait a second. These aren't these giant open environments that have a ton of secrets to find. There's going to be one or two here or there to continue to expound upon the lore of the game and some of the characters that you meet along the way. But you're right, it's not like the jiggies or the stars or the coins and some of those other 3D platformers. Which again, going to the influence piece, going through a game like this, I was like, oh, this flute. It's kind of like an ocarina, right? Like you begin to discover the influences that the developers probably had when making the game. But again, it's that sense of discovery. You have all of these unique puzzle pieces as opposed to just this is just Mario, right? You have the stars, you have the coins, you have the signature music. So yeah, it's cool.
And it's funny you mentioned the ocarina. When that mechanic was first introduced, for the uninitiated, you have to play music because he uses song magic, which is why I thought he was a bard. To do certain things, and you get some interesting music and cutscene clips because of it. I initially was like, "Oh, it's one of these freaking mechanics." Then my wife walked by and said, "Oh, it's like Ocarina." The second she said that, I wasn't annoyed by the mechanic anymore. I was like,
Mm,
"Oh, I've done this. Yeah, this is familiar enough. Yeah, you know what? It's not so bad. It's not so, the music's pretty good. I kind of like it." And then eventually
yeah.
my muscle memory kicked in because it's very handy where it's basically just like L1, R1, L2, R2, and then different combinations of holding 2 to 3 buttons each, I think it is. But once you got that motion down because it's symmetric, it's not that
Hmm.
difficult. It's not even time consuming. The patterns,
Yeah.
they purposely do not pick ultra uh, complex patterns. They want you to get through this part because I
Hmm.
think they also wanted this to be marketable to little kids.
Wow. So my camera has a mind of its own. We've moved beyond that. Depending on how much of that Alex leaves in, you're
All
welcome.
of it.
You're welcome for that. But what I was saying is the flute that you use. I was initially kind of worried because it maps all the notes to the different buttons on the controller, and it never provides you any kind of note sheet or like cheat sheet for you to like remember which notes map to each button. But you're right; it's very simple and pretty basic, and the the complexity of the puzzles using the flute kind of builds on itself over the course of the game. So you become more like increasingly familiar with which notes map to which buttons. And by the end, I kind of had made a note for myself that like I'd play an entire rhythm game based on this little flute, just because it became a lot of fun. And even some of like the semi boss type battles use it in pretty unique ways. I think so. Ton of fun.
What I picked up on with the flute towards the end, even the symbols they use, like left is a less than, and then right is a greater than symbol.
Oh yeah.
I did not realize that until like I was almost done through the game, and I was just like, man, I am so freaking oblivious to so much, to so
Yeah,
much
no,
stuff. Like it literally explained it, but like without explaining it, and I feel like that is actually really great because in terms of tutorial stuff, there really isn't one other than,
mm,
hit X to jump.
mhm,
Because even with some platformers today, like even we'll say, the the old guard and
mhm.
even some of the newer ones, I'm like, it's a platformer. Why am I spending 45 minutes on the tutorial? Like, let me do it, you know?
Mhm.
Um, I understand it's a whole accessibility thing. I'm all about that. But I think part of the magic is also figuring it out for yourself, you know? And especially in a story like this one, where Nunu is learning about himself and is going on this journey, I think should there be some form of tutorial so as a player you have some agency, sure. But I think you should also be allowed to go on that journey yourself. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, and I feel like the game does a good enough job where at times it does the Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok type of thing, where Nunu will be a bit of an Atreus of like, I think we're supposed to go over there type of
Hmm.
thing, and it'll kind of guide the player. But I don't think it does it in a way where it becomes an annoyance because the puzzle solving it doesn't really say, hey, I think you're supposed to hit that lever over there. It really does allow the player to kind of figure out those things on its own. It's more navigating the world and the environments where it's like, hey, I can't wait to go over there, Willump, and do this new thing and figure out what's next type of thing.
Last part about the game. What'd you think of the snowball fights?
When that happened, I was like, hell yes. This to me, that was the moment I'm like, this game has so much personality, and the developers are just having so much fun allowing these characters to just step away from the gaminess of it and just be kids. You know what I mean? And there was actually, I don't know if you won all the snowball fights,
Oh,
but
I did.
there was a literal trophy and an achievement for beating Willow because each character has a health bar when these snowball fights start. And there's like a whole animation sequence too, like Nunu jumps up in the air and it's like has like a boxing bell like ding ding ding. All right, let's start the new snowball fight match. And I thought, gosh, this game is just overflowing with so much charm. It's amazing. I love it.
Yeah, and I thought for me personally, I was like, okay, like I like when the first one happened, I was like, okay, this is clear to teach a mechanic, and it's not.
Yeah.
It is literally, hey, Nunu's like 8, like let him be 8.
Yes.
and Willump is basically like his grandpa like pet buddy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Let him be the guardian. Like, and it's very much like I could see me as a kid doing that, not so much with my uncle, but more so with my dad. Because actually that just reminds me. So pulling this back a bit, did you ever go sledding as a kid?
Yeah.
So I grew up in Manhattan, which we have Central Park, and I remember my dad bought me a sled, not like a full blown sled, like one of like those like plastic roll up
Plasticky ones.
sleds.
Yep.
So we found this massive hill because my dad and I we used to spend so much time in Central Park when I was a kid. Like if I go in there today, I could take if you ever come to New York, I could take you anywhere in that park. Like I have it memorized. And we went to this massive hill and he brought me up to the top. He bought two of them, one for him, one for me. He went down and he said, just follow my pattern, and he went down. I followed right after him and I was like laughing. He was like, it's so much fun. We run back up. The third time we did it, he was like, okay, you have to go by yourself and I'm going to push you. So you go even faster. Little kid, exciting. He pushes me. The sled was going so fast, I couldn't control it and I started to steer towards a tree.
Oh no.
And I rolled out of the way like just in time, like, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Missed the tree, crashed into the tree. My dad didn't see the impact, but he saw the sled go like flying.
Oh no.
So he ran so he ran down there and he was like, "Oh my God." And sure enough, some older lady was there and was already yelling at me, like, "Your kid almost died." Da, 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 da.
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
I don't know why, like seeing the snowball fight, like it reminds me of that, but there's less death and dismemberment. But it's
Yeah.
like that is something like you would do with like an 8-year-old, like just let them unwind and do stuff that, you as an adult may not do, I guess.
Well, and just kind of quickly piggybacking up on that, like related to sledding, there's a whole mechanic where multiple times you're like sledding down a mountainside with Willump as kind of your acting sled. Think like the Klonoa 2 type levels and things that were very prominent during the PS2 era, and it just continued to kind of stroke that kind of nostalgic itch that I was looking for from this game. So fun.
Yeah, I attribute that a lot to the Penguins in Mario 64 as well.
Yep. Yeah.
But all right. So I think it goes without saying we're both really hot on this game.
Absolutely.
Um, I didn't expect to be as hot on it. And truthfully speaking, I thought by the time you got to the puzzles, you'd be like, F this game.
Yeah.
Like it went from what would you give it like score wise?
So I have to kind of take you on that like quick 15-second journey. It really immediately going in, I thought like, okay, big, open, colorful, wintry environments, lots of collectibles to find. But in the first 15 minutes, I'm like, oh, it's not that type of game. So I think when I kind of reframed my and recalibrated my thinking a little bit and just accepted the game for what it was, I enjoyed it exponentially more than like going in and saying, why isn't this Banjo Kazooie? Why isn't this ukulele? And with that, looking at the game from that lens, and again, just accepting it for what it was, thoroughly enjoying it beginning to end, even with the puzzles, I would say like 8.5.
So I'm pretty much in the same boat on that one. I originally went into this thinking same as you, open world 3D platformer, maybe a little bit more combat driven.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say almost like a Spyro, basically like a spin around, just like guys running around, you smack them around a bit.
Yep.
And it was none of that. It was much more into the platform. It was much more into the puzzles, which I appreciate. And it was also more so about spectacle and story, which I
Mm-hmm.
also appreciate.
Yep.
But in terms of trying to think of a similar game, I really can't think of one other than saying Uncharted, and that's a completely different thing altogether.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. I mean, it borrows a lot of mechanics from a lot of different games, but I can't point to and say it's kind of like Mario 64. It's kind of like New Super Lucky's. It's its own unique game that borrows influences from a lot of different things. And I think that's what makes the game so unique. And I would really strongly recommend folks to give it a try.
So if you could go back from the original list I sent you with such titles as Gex, would you have picked a different game having played this one, or do you think you would have stuck with this one?
No, very, very glad that I selected this one. Looking back on that list, no regrets because again, it goes back to what I said earlier. I kind of knew what I was getting into with a lot of those other games that you had on the list, and I really didn't with this one.
That's how I kind of felt too. I was like, okay, this one, me as the one who made the list, I was like, okay, this is a safe one. This is one like Gex 3 Enter the Gecko, which is arguably licensed movie hell.
Yeah.
Well, I was like, I was pretty sure you were going to pick that one, to be honest. And
Hmm.
I was really excited because I have not played that in years. And you're like, oh, Song of Nunu. I was like, okay, Song of Nunu it is then.
Yep.
That there goes my weekend.
Hmm.
Um, but no, I'm very happy you picked it. I had such a blast with it, and I don't think it overstayed its welcome like some of these games do. Uh,
Yes.
like Donkey Kong Country Returns, I feel like is like 50 levels too long, for
Mm.
instance.
Hmm.
All right, so that brings us to the end of this whole spiel. Growing up platformers, nostalgia, and tackling back into that childhood, I guess you could say, wonder
Hmm.
with the song of Nunu. But before we go, and Rusty plugs himself one more time through Samuel Shelf promotion, I want to ask you one final question. Three things that you love about video games as a hobby.
Mm.
And you can't say playing them.
Yeah. I think one, I think the sense of escapism, when you're kids, whether you had a great childhood or there were some rough patches, I could point to a number of different games over the course of my life that I retreated to those worlds. Fable 2 being a great one when I was in high school, some really difficult, dark times for me. Going into the world of Albion and having that companion dog, it really felt like I was just in a dreamlike world and having an unforgettable journey. And fast forward to a nightmare of a year like 2020 and playing Xenoblade Chronicles for the first time, the definitive edition on Switch, and playing that game, those giant open environments, wandering the plains, the sense of escapism and the music that really helps you to immerse yourself into those worlds, going on a journey and getting to discover who these characters are, why you care about them, learning the intricacies of the combat system, those types of things, I think, are the reason that I continue to play games 25 plus years later from when I started as a kid and wandered into my dad's guest bedroom on the waterbed playing golf, right? So the sense of escapism and immersion for sure. I think another reason is I've always had a love of music growing up. My mom was into U2, Led Zeppelin, Boston, Styx, just kind of like classic rock. My dad surprisingly was into old school funk like Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind and Fire, the Gap Band. So I've always had kind of an eclectic mix and love of different types of music. And so anytime I play a game, I didn't know it when I was playing things on the N64, like Grant Kirkhope's many soundtracks or David Wise, that those would have stuck with me years later. But now, anytime I play a game, I always have an ear for music. And off to my left here, I have a collection of video game vinyl soundtracks. So the music in games is always something that's incredibly special to me. And I have a tremendous fondness for hearing, listening to, and discovering new video game soundtracks. So that's another big piece of it. And then I think the last one is just it's afforded me the opportunity to meet so many amazing people. And I'm not just saying that. Like, I was a very insecure kid growing up, and a lot of my friends, when they were going out for sports and going on dates and going to prom, I was at home playing Lord of the Rings Battle for Middle Earth 2 on my Xbox 360. And I'm like, I want to keep discovering and learning about games, but I also want to have an outlet to talk about them. And so I got my old HP laptop and all of its 360p glory, and I opened up that webcam and I started talking about Dragon Ball Origins 2 because that's the game I bought at Play and Trade that day. And that set me off on a journey of self discovery and learning about games, discovering my voice, just the journey of confidence as a young adult person. But more than that, all the people I've met along the way throughout this YouTube journey, and you talk about the glory days of the YouTube gaming community back then, but they really were glory days for a reason because there wasn't this need to I liken YouTube today like Instagram. You need to have a nice filter. You need to take your photos in a certain way. Whereas back then, none of that mattered. It really was purely about a mutual love of games. And I've met and am still connected to so many amazing people 10, 12, nearly actually 15 years later. Steph's Too Deaf, you, um, TV and Lust, Craig. I mean, I could name so many people, but I continue to meet new folks 15 years later, like Blinkoom and so many others. So, yeah, the sense of immersion and escapism, the music, but the community of people that I've met because of games, I think is probably the reason why I love this hobby so much.
That is probably the most well thought out third answer you could have given to that because I completely feel the same way about it. I mean, I love music as well. I mean, I have guitars behind me. Um, and, and it when it comes to escape, I've talked about that in nauseam, but that sense of community, I really do think is the best part about this hobby, and
Mhm.
that you don't even need to play the same games. You know,
Yep.
um, one of my closest friends is not. I mean, he's a hardcore Yu-Gi-Oh player, right? Like card game wise. I pitched him the idea of like Dual Links online. He's like, no, no, no. I like to handle physical cards. But he'll also tell me, "Oh my god, I've been watching competitive Hearthstone videos all day." Like, he's much into that. Like, he goes to forums, he watches esports. He's into that. He's
Mhm.
the universe of it. He just doesn't actively participate. He watches. And I think that's like the brilliant thing. Like, you don't need to be 150% on any particular thing. You just have to be interested
Yep.
to see it. And it's like even touching on the whole music thing. I mean, like my mom, hardcore Neil Diamond fan. And to this day, I love Neil Diamond. Like
Mm.
nobody is a better songwriter than him other than Bob Dylan. But my wife's dad is a hardcore folk Bob Dylan fan. I've seen
Mhm.
Bob Dylan 4 times. Like because I don't know how much longer he has. But as you know, I listen to metal 99% of the time. But because I am so involved in music. I experience all of it, but if you ask me what my preferred is, I'll tell you metal all day, every day.
Yeah.
But I saw George Clinton, the P Funk All Stars, like 2 years ago, and that was probably one of the best concerts I've ever been to. And I will say that without shadow of a doubt. So,
Very cool.
Rusty, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for troubleshooting with me about an hour and a half before we actually started doing anything. I hope, I hope any of this got recorded because this was truly fun, truly insightful, and I do feel like, and I'm not just saying this, I feel like I know you more now
Yeah.
than I did before going into this. So before we kick it off, one last time, where can people find you? What are you doing? What's coming down the pipe? When is the Otaku Brothers starting back up? Because I have nothing to do Tuesdays.
Yes. So a couple things. You can find me on YouTube, LOOIE. Coming down the pipe, I have two videos depending on when this comes out. I'll probably the one that's
Never.
perfect. The one that's further out is the 10 most memorable games in my life. And it's not necessarily my favorite, what I consider the best, but it is a video that Blinkoom actually tagged me in a year and a half ago, and I've not gotten around to actually recording it, but I've solidified my list of 10 games, some of which I talked about today. But I'm just looking forward to kind of taking folks on that journey of over the course of my life, games that kind of inserted themselves at very unique times and why they are important to me. And of course, memorable. So that's the next big video I have coming down the pipeline. When are the Otaku Brothers coming back together and coming out with a new album and touring again? Well, hopefully before the baby comes. I'd love to do one more episode with Ryan because my time will be much more scarce once our baby daughter here arrives in a couple short months. But the hope would be that we, of course, get together at the tail end of the year and chronicle the year that was like we normally do, talk about our top 10 favorite games, and of course, do a 2 to 3, maybe 4 hour community special reading all of your ridiculous emails. So, more Otaku Brothers and LOOIE soon.
Awesome, awesome. I look forward to it. Hopefully next Tuesday, so I have something to do.
Well, one last thing I want to interject, Alex, is I want to thank you so much for having me on. Everything that you said, I echo right back to you. It's amazing that we've been connected in some fashion on YouTube for over a decade, probably at this point. So it's so cool that we've stayed connected. We probably need to play better games together outside of Wolfenstein Youngblood. So
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
God we played this game and have better memories associated with playing games together. But I do remember fondly that night when we were mic'd up, and I think we talked more about life that night than we did actually playing Wolfenstein Youngblood, and that's probably for the best.
Yeah, I think I just ran into gunfire and she's like, "Oh, well, I died. Okay, now we can talk again." So,
Yeah, but thank
great.
you so much for having me on. Really do appreciate it. This was a ton of fun.
Absolutely. More to come soon, everybody. Thanks for watching.